Langville, my principal collaborator, and we talked about ranking. And so with the opportunity to speak here again, I thought that rather than talk about an algorithm like ranking, many of the questions that came my way, we spoke right before the break, had to do with how to move into sports, what types of things learning algorithms would work well with, and so that's really the emphasis of today's talk. So I'm going to start a little bit by giving a little bit more background as to the program that I work in at Davidson. Davidson is a liberal arts school of approximately 2,000 students, and it's entirely undergraduate. So first of all, who am I? Rather than just a title and a name, exactly where am I coming from in doing sports? Well, first of all, in terms of the type of things that I do, is this is really me doing research. Is that often I get to go to a game and I get to watch the game, and more importantly, I listen to the people around me. Is that one of the most principal ways that I can get ideas for research is simply by listening to what people think, at least, they're seeing on the court. They're usually not correct, but nonetheless, it's the impressions that they have that insight and data can help us. So it either gives me directions of what to explore, and also the insights that we believe are correct that we as data scientists have to, in a sense, undo. So this is the conference tournament for the A10 tournament in Brooklyn, and to my immediate right is a woman who shared many of her insights about the way the team should be coached as the game was proceeding. And this picture is credited to the New York Times because I was fortunate to be covered for the program that I have at Davidson. So this is one slide on the program I have. Again, it's run by undergraduates. These are 3 of the students sitting at the sideline, and they will be recording data. So unlike the NBA, we do not have cameras in the ceiling. If you're not familiar with that, the NBA has cameras in the ceiling that I actually decided I'd have this as a strobe presentation, so I hope that no one here struggles with that. If you need to, you may leave. But anyway, the NBA has 6 cameras that shine down on the court and record data approximately every 24th of a second. And so if for no other reason you want to email me, the NBA accidentally leaked half a season a year and a half ago, and of course I have it. So if you would like that, I can send it to you. It is literally raw data. So it is XY coordinates of each player. If you want to be mathy, then they're projected on the XY plane. That seems entirely unnecessary to say, but nonetheless. And then it's XYZ of the ball. So you have that data, which is very granular data, and then you also but you don't have, for instance, when a shot is made. You have to actually aggregate that with other information, and the sensors in themselves are not always correct. So suddenly the ball can move, particularly in the first year, faster than the speed of light, not because it was passed hard, but because the ball was hidden by large bodies, so it thought someone's bald head was a ball. So instead, I have undergraduate students recording data at the sidelines that we study. We have heat map code that we study. And that's led to students working, for instance, with the Chicago Sky, which is a WNBA team. I have a former member of the group. We call ourselves the Cat Stats because we're the Wildcats, the Davidson Wildcats. We're doing analytics for the Bulls. One of my students just interned with the Panthers, and we're working on a project for them. And in the upper left, someone worked with Stats, if you're familiar with that company. We don't just do basketball, which is the purpose of the graphic at the bottom. We also work in soccer. We do a little bit in baseball. Which I want to say a very little bit because Davidson went very far last year, and it was not because of us. So if there was Moneyball, it was not because of analytics. It was because of just flat hard work on the part of the coaches and the athletes. And then finally, we work in football as well. That has enabled us to do things in professional sports. We are still working on a project with the NBA League Office. A lot of times people assume that means in the players. It's not. It's in officiating analytics instead, so on trying to study what officials do. That's about as much of that a project as I'm allowed to talk about. We've worked on projects with the Hornets. If you don't follow the NBA, that's an NBA team. If you follow the NBA, that's an NBA team. And we've done this project with the Panthers, which was related to the draft. A lot of people think that means we told them which player to pick. It was not. They did not want another model on that at all. They wanted to know, essentially, the probability of a player still being available at a particular pick. That's about as much as I'm able to say, but I think you can kind of interpret the type of information that would be there. We've worked with fantasy draft sites, which is, I really like that because a lot of people want to use machine learning to play fantasy, which is fine, but we were on the flip side of what do you set the salaries to be if you're at all familiar with fantasy draft. And it actually is dependent on the particular website because the way that they put together the salaries have a huge role in how the game is played, who can win, the distribution of the money, and so that was a very interesting and fun project. If you don't know the South very well, particularly North Carolina, Davidson is situated right in the middle of NASCAR country. So I've also worked on NASCAR, which I know very little about and does become more of a math problem. But NASCAR is a very difficult analytics question, any question they ask, because there are so many moving parts, not just in the car, but on the entire team, from the pit crew to everything else that they're trying to manage. Then in the upper right, we supplied analytics for the German national basketball team, and with the tools that you've seen up to now. That's led to us working with national media, so we've been asked questions, analytics questions by ESPN, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, NCAA with March Madness, and then the most interesting one is usually sports science. If you've ever watched that show, they'll call and ask me for help, and they always needed it about 2 hours ago. So those are always, if you're familiar with the expression back of the envelope derivations. So some of the tools we've learned today that are quite involved just don't work because you have to do it very quickly. So anyway, that's the breadth of experience that this is coming from. It's not just college teams, which will be the kind of the brunt of a lot of what I'm presenting today, but a lot of what we do plays a part in a lot of these various things that I'm outlining today. For instance, over lunch when I came in, I was emailing an NBA GM about something that they want to know about. So it's just the nature of the work that I do. All right, so we believe, not surprisingly for us, that math and data equals impact. That must have come off a math talk, because it's really math and computer science. But if I'm giving it to a math department, they're not uncomfortable with computer science, but they like it if it just, I have the plus symbol, so that probably, maybe it should say plus equal, but no, whatever. But anyway, it gives you the impact. So the fun thing I want to talk to you about, just again to give people a sense of where could you play in this field if you were interested in sports, whether it's just like as a vertical with a company, or if it's even casually for fun, as we saw earlier with the drone project of recognizing someone's face rather than a dragon, is that sometimes people get involved in these things more recreationally, and then you can post on blogs if you're interested in that. Nylon Calculus is a blog which is read by NBA league offices. So one of my principal members of the CatStats group 2 years ago came to my attention from the NBA league office. I got an email and said, tell us more about this student. And I had to look up who in the world this student was, and he had not worked with me at all, and I knew that because I would have known his name. So they do look and they do read it. But anyway, let's see some of the areas that you could get involved in. One of them is actually as game preparation in terms of what I mean by that is the idea there is that the analytics, the numbers, whichever way you want to look at it, the insights, whatever you're trying to trigger, is trying to indicate to the coaches how to jump into their preparations for a game. You can talk about Moneyball and that the movie is wonderful and it gives a sense of what analytics might do, at least from a certain standpoint, but it also can be very misleading because underneath that movie is the idea of resistance to analytics. People's jobs rely on this. People are trying to win. And also that if you only have so much talent, you're still not going to win. I mean, you might do better, but you're still not necessarily going to win. And sometimes this audience is probably not one of those, but if you work in sports analytics, people think that you're just going to transform a team because they've watched Moneyball one too many times. And one of the big places that you can impact, which again I don't think is surprising in here is a number indicating to you that this is something, a warning of something you need to look at as you prepare for the game. Something you need to watch in the tape, something you need to coach for the team to be ready. And the reason the stopwatch is there is that saves the coaches considerable time. And they're very dependent on my team to get those aspects ready for them, and they expect them 2 days before the game, period. Otherwise, you can't be part of the group in that role. The other one is game time. That's usually what people think about, is they expect us to be telling the team what to do. That is, very, very few people in analytics are actually doing that. By the time the game rolls around, everything is so contextual that feeling as if analytics can fully say how a team could be coached is generally not the case. But the quote that you see at the bottom that Matt McKillop, an assistant coach who's on your left, gave to the New York Times was, it kind of blew us away and it really opened our eyes. So it broadened the view of what they could do in the game, in the toolkit that they had from which they choose what they would do, and it would inform their decisions during the game. But that's one of the hardest ones to have an impact on, but that sometimes people are hoping that they can. One of the big places we have an impact is on the off season. So at the top you see a table which are what we call lineup efficiencies. That would be an area that this group would be comfortable moving into, is that we have automated code that goes out and reads the game play-by-play, and then it determines you don't need to know what these statistics are, but they're an array of statistics that the coaches are interested in. Here you have Brian Sullivan, who's the player shooting. What happens when he's on and off the court? And then you can do it in 2-man pairs, 3-man pairs, 5-man pairs, whatever you want. And they analyze it in all those different ways. And then you'll notice that we always say how many times, the sample size. And so we begin doing them in early November, but it isn't until mid-January that they begin to take on meaning because the sample sizes are too small. This is very important in the off-season in college because of the fact that it indicates what you're losing and where you have to replace things. During the season, it can indicate a player that does not have the individual statistics to say that they are having a big impact on the court, but every time they come on, they do. Someone who plays well beyond the ball or off ball. All right, so that's what that particular one does quite a bit. Oh, and then the other one in the lower left, I don't know how low, but whatever, is the heat maps. And that's where we keep track of every shot and who took it, the type of shot, and we actually keep track of 13 pieces of information per shot. And when you look at this picture, it can seem as if it doesn't really tell you much other than Davidson shoots a lot of three-pointers. And that's exactly why the coaches agreed that I could show you this picture. So these pictures can give a lot of information, and often teams are very careful about what they're willing to show. Another place that we don't do a lot of work is in fan engagement. That's a rather large space where the students I work with could get jobs with teams, is that the marketing analytics is extremely important, from engaging fans that aren't in the stadium to getting them in the stadium. The one that I'm going to spend the most time on is actually transforming athletes, and in particular in injury prevention. So this is the biometric data. This is where large data sets are being created, and in many cases people don't really know what to do with them except what the companies are offering them, which in some cases it's hard to completely tell what the companies know what they're doing with the data that they're providing. So the research that I'm funded with is with a subcontract from a company based out of Seattle called Athlete Intelligence. And they, here are some of their customers in terms of, it's not just smaller colleges like Davidson. If in football you have LSU and University of Washington, which isn't as surprising. So you have large programs with potential NFL players coming out of them. And they have 3 devices that measure impact. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped which slide I was waiting for, thanks. The goal of this is what we call coachable insights. The idea of this is that you're looking again for something where the coaches can coach the team to be safer, whether it be technique, it's usually technique, but it can also be the amount that how tired they are. There was an insight made either last year or the year before with an NFL player that his performance dropped considerably. And all he did was wear a GPS device, and they figured out that he was running 3 to 4 times anyone else on the team. And the reason for that was he was showing everyone else what to do. So he was just running and running and running, and then they limited that, and his performance began to go up. But in some cases, your performance doesn't go up. Is that if you overtrain and overperform, about 2 weeks after that, your performance drops, and you can't just rest. You have to have significant rest to ever actually improve again, which is why some teams, they believe, perform quite poorly and below standards in conference tournaments, is that the team is just flat exhausted. So it's that type of thing that this is gearing toward and that you're looking for. If the insight is interesting, then but not coachable, usually that means it's interesting to a fan. But if it's interesting and coachable, then that's what we're really looking for at this time. Okay, so these are the three devices that they currently have. The dominant one that they use is on your left, and that's a mouthpiece, so it measures impact. The one in the middle is largely used for ice hockey, which goes on the helmet. And then the one on your right is, as you see by the size, that isn't a super quarter, it is a quarter, is a device that will go in a headband. And once it's released, which will be relatively soon, we'll be using it at Davidson with women's soccer. So what we're trying to do right now is lay a strong foundation with this data to get it ready for machine learning and other such algorithms. So that's the part I want to talk with you about now, because that's the part that you would want to do. And you wouldn't have to do this with athlete intelligence. People wear devices all the time. My phone is keeping track of my steps. My wife has an iPhone, which keeps track of all kinds of data. About a week ago, at 10 o'clock at night, we were going to bed, she suddenly stood up. And I was like, "What are you doing?" She's like, "I haven't met my standing goal today." And so, anyway, that's precisely why I don't wear one. But nonetheless, it can be a little interesting. So goal one, we're going to have, I believe, 3 goals. Let's talk about each of those, and you could be involved in any stages of this that would help companies and help the field. The first is enriching the data. So you get the raw data, like the sport view data. I even talked about enriching, I think I said it went through my head, is that you don't know when the ball goes in. So how do you figure it out? You pull down play-by-play and figure out, did the ball go in? And then you look around that time to figure out what's happening on the court around the time that the play-by-play says that the ball went in, which actually isn't as exact as those devices. So adding the right data creates an asset. At Tresata, we often call it a data asset, emphasizing the fact that the data in its own right can be very valuable. So what would we add to something like this? Well, in a little bit, we're going to see that saying that something is practice or a game can be quite important. We've been adding heart rate monitors, so a whole new device, and what that can offer. We've been very interested in sleep and its impact. That has been very difficult to track and figure out its impact. And then finally, weather, which we very quickly saw impacts on. In particular, students from the South, or athletes from the South, do not play well in cold weather, which is not terribly surprising, but it's interesting to begin to see in what way. What does that mean? And is there a way to train for that? So the question, can adding these lead to more coachable insights? Can it lead to more data? Obviously, you're putting more data in it, but is it worth the amount of time so that it can actually create an asset in its own right? The first thing about this data as well is that the data individually is not necessarily that large. You have 6 megabytes will be one athlete's file for a practice or a game, but then you have all the athletes over all the practices of games, and to get the insights you need, you begin to go over multiple seasons. So it gets quite large quite fast, which for a group like this is quite fun. If you don't have the right tools, can be quite frustrating, which is one reason I'm glad that I'm with Tresata, because Tresata works on everything they produce is scalable. So even, this was a Game of Thrones, which I didn't know would be apropos to a morning talk, but we did some Game of Thrones predictions with the current season, and the visualization tool is akin to something like Tableau, but on the size of data we have, Tableau can just stall and just stop, and the tool of Tresata called Tides does not, which is because it's scalable. So it's quite powerful and helpful. The next thing is to improve insights. So the first one is get the data. Once you get the data, you want to improve what you're seeing over what you believe you're seeing. So the first thing is just to identify when are concerning things happening. The company has already done a good job at that. So here I have their platform to give you a sense of the end product, where it pops out on an iPad or an iPhone. For instance, here we have an athlete's head, and it's indicating the size of the impact in different regions of the head. We have not worked as much on this. We've been working on trying to, if you have a concerning impact, why is it occurring and when is it occurring, which is what I mean by contextualizing. So we're going to first look at football. So we're given football data of impacts. So here you have an athlete with impacts to their head, and we broke them up by position. So you have linebackers and you have offensive line. So you can get a sense of where they're hitting largely in the front of the head. But then you go to quarterbacks and kickers, and you see that the dominant place is actually in the back of the head. So we had to think a little bit about that and watch some tape, and it's largely, can you think what that would be? It's largely because the back of the head hits the ground. So it's not necessarily they're actually hitting a player, it's that they're hitting the ground when they go down. So we didn't know what that was when we saw it initially. And usually when you say it, it begins to make sense. But that was one of the things we had. Here's one for, it's practice and game. Yeah, practice and game, showing you the average impact by position. So I guess they're not labeled. Oh yeah, they are at the top. So you have the center is hit much, much harder in the game. That's what you're seeing on the left. The ones that are quite different are the defensive end and the center. But if you look very carefully, you'll actually see that a quarterback is hit harder in practice than in the game, which was extremely surprising. The only reason we could think of that is because they put the second string quarterback in practice. Might be actually why that's occurring. But if that was surprising to the coach, then they would need to begin to look at that. So those are the types of things that when you begin to slice and dice, you can begin to get insights on, and in time, create algorithms that detect when it's concerning. Like you need to be actually looking at, is that statistically significant, and things like that. And then here's another one that was a big insight that came out of this work, is that fatigue leads to poor form. So if you look at the left, you have impacts that were very similar to what we saw earlier, but on the right you see impacts on the crown of the head. And that's where you do not want a football player ramming into someone, because those are the most concerning. And those were later in the game in terms of what we saw. And when you looked, it was because they were fatigued and they were dropping their head, which is a coachable moment, because you need to begin to condition the team better and then remind them that we need to be paying attention to this at this time of the game. Because at some point when a player gets a concussion, they are pulled and they're not playing. So it impacts everyone. So now I'll turn to women's soccer. The device that you see in the lower left is a polar heart monitor. So it is worn around the waist and measures their heart rate and GPS throughout the game. So the Polar came up with what they call load, and they are told that they cannot exceed 1,200 in a week's time. We would like to be able to investigate that more, but that's one of those trade secrets where they don't share it. And so in time we may create our own measures, because it's concerning to be making decisions on an athlete's health and also simply their actual playing time when you're not necessarily sure where the analytics fully coming from. So here's one that has to do with load. So this is no longer impact. And this is to help you see it's giving average training load for the opponent's style. So there are 3 styles listed here. On the left is direct, which is basically you're getting the ball, this isn't the way they talk about it, but you're getting the ball directly where you want it. So that's where you do longer passes and push the ball up in that way. Possession on the right is where it would come out of the backfield and you slowly progress the ball up through more dribbling. In the middle is mixed. The idea there is you should see that they're not the same. Depending on the type of team you're playing, the Davidson women's team has a different load on it. And if you do believe that the team should not exceed certain loads, it begins to indicate to you the type of practices that you should have. And then in time, you can begin to look at the impact of practices and begin to actually craft practices that have the type of performance that you want, but then also have the type of athletic rest and performance you want, given the just the athleticism of the team, given the way that you've prepared them both through playing and through rest. Then this is one that just kind of gives some insight on the types of things of where we'd go. There isn't a lot to this slide, is that it shows the distances that the players have gone. So if we just move away from load, you can of course look at other things in terms of who did we play and what was the impact. So again, that you can do predictive analytics to predict how a team will play, to say how you should practice prior to that time. Why? Because a team plays more than one game in a week. So if you're not careful, you massively exceed those loads and your team begins to burn out, which was something that the women's soccer team did struggle with 3 seasons ago when they hit the conference tournament and had for a couple years. So the last thing would be predict, is that you actually want to use these insights to predict things, to tell you potentially what types of things would be good for you to practice, given who you're going to play, telling you how to train a team, given who they're going to play. Maybe you'll play more aggressively against certain football teams and things like that. Once you have the rich data, once you have figured out ways to slice and dice the data, as well as places that you may not, that's when you're ready for the machine learning part of an algorithmic part to actually begin to pull that out. And that's the stage that we're at right now with athlete intelligence. And that's the stage where many of you could have an impact as well, but you have to actually begin with the data itself, because many times the data is just dropped. So you could get, for instance, your Fitbit data, but then what? And often it's that aggregating that begins to create richer data sets for people. So the last goal is to create consumable and understandable data, and it would appear again in some form here on a desktop if the coach was back at his or her office, and it can also appear on iPads, for instance, possibly on the sideline. The other part that's important is the amount of data. How much data are you giving a coach or a player? And that depends on the coach and it depends on the player. Some players, if you tell them too much, you get in their head and then they don't play as well because they're trying to play to the data insight. Other players play better if they have the insight. Some players don't care what you say, they're just going to play the game. And so you have to present it in a different way. And the same thing can be true with coaches. And one very quick story is that in one of the sports I worked with, the coach said, I only want this one thing. So it was with hitting. I want pitching, but no hitting. I don't want hitting. Going with my gut. It's like, all right, then we'll just do pitching. Once we showed the pitching results, then there was interest in the hitting. So sometimes it changes with understanding. The mindset changes in terms of the willingness to look at the data, but we never really venture farther than someone is comfortable. So very quick, someone drew a cartoon of me, so I guess I like looking at it. But the first thing, again, is coachable. If it's not coachable or in business, if it's not actionable, then you have to question precisely what is the goal of what you're doing. The second is consumable. They need to actually not, I mean, it might be great for you, but if you have to have a graduate degree to understand what you're saying, they probably don't have a graduate degree in what you're saying, and they need to be able to consume it so they can get to the third one, which is understand it. A coach needs to be able to understand the model well enough that they understand the limits of the model so they can make decisions on it. It may be affirming to see someone actually choose something based off your result, but they should be basing that result off of a very precise understanding of that opinion. Because what we do are models. Models have their limits and are simplifications of the world. And so when they have that full information, then they're able to fully make decisions, and you truly are part of the team, and in a sense, you're a sideline coach, which for some of us is actually a rather affirming thing. So I believe that you can learn to stay fit, and you can stay fit with your Fitbit if you wanted by getting the data. So I thank you for your attention, and I have time for a couple questions if you have any. Are there any questions? Yes? What does the device in the headband measure? It's the same thing. So I can't remember, it's all impact data, but it is about 15 rows. So it has a gyroscope in there, and so that it is measuring the quickness and the direction of the hit. But I don't remember each little piece, which mainly reflects I didn't take enough physics in my background, because we actually meet with physics professors to go over carefully. But think of it a lot like your iPhone in terms of the way that your iPhone knows, or whatever phone. I have an iPhone, but whatever your smartphone. Yeah, the question is the goal location tracking? Yes, the goal is location of an impact of, in this case, both of them, the head in particular. Yep. Anybody else? Yes.
So way back on your first slide, when you were talking to your bleacher mate at the game.
Yes.
You said you were initially listening to what people were saying, gather kind of their insights.
Yes.
Did you then engage them with more clarifying questions?
Yes. Usually the question is when I'm in the stand and someone said, or to paraphrase, when someone asks me a question, do I ask clarifying questions? So let me tell you a quicker story than with her. I was sitting next to someone when Davidson was playing a team, and very early the person went, we're going to lose. And we were predicted to win by 15 points. And I said, really? And they said, yeah. And I said, why? Well, because we're playing too quickly. Well, why would that cause a problem? Because we change our playing style when we play quickly. How are you seeing that? And I just kind of walk through questions until I at least feel I'm seeing a better glimpse of what they're seeing. And what they meant was is that the analytics that is, what makes a Davidson team doesn't hold when we play too fast, at least according to that fan, is that once we speed up enough, who we are kind of breaks down. So shooting percentage isn't the same, just for instance, when we play at that speed. And so we were playing to their style was what the original statement, I think, was. So that's usually what I ask. I have time for one more, and then I need to stop.
Do any of the competing teams find that your IoT-enabled athletes are an unfair advantage and complain to the athletic conference?
No, we have not had them complain to the athletic conferences. We have had... One quick thing, though, is we have helped other teams get started. So Utah, Notre Dame, Illinois, and small colleges like Roanoke have all been involved in that type of thing as well and interested in that. The one thing is that our coaches are always willing for us to share the tech that we create. So we're not a company, we're academia, so we just share the things that we have, but not the insights we have on our own team. So, all right, thank you for your attention.